Anyone who has a contract with the federal government and all their subcontractors has to have affirmative action. And that means keeping track of race and sex of your employees and even potential hires, looking for disparities and then setting goals and timetables in order to correct any disparities that you find. And basically, this is a big deal because this reached deep into the private sector, something like 25% of the workforce, because a lot of huge companies have government contracts and some of them aspire to have government contracts. And so the Trump administration ended that. They basically went the other direction and said you can't have affirmative action if you are a government contractor, and even told the government to start looking at like violations of DEI within universities and within the private sector and within nonprofits. Almost everything that you could think of that you can do on affirmative action.
Hi, welcome. This is the From the New World podcast. Today I'm speaking with Richard Hanania, the author of the Richard Hanania newsletter, The Origins of Woke, Public Choice Theory and Illusions of Grand Strategy, as well as a forthcoming book, Elite Human Capital. We discuss how the Trump administration ended DEI, what's left in disparate impact law, Richard's next project and what elite human capital means, and how Ezra Klein can save the Democratic Party from neurotic women. If you liked this episode, the best way to help us out is to let a friend know, either in person or online. You're not only helping us, but you're helping your friend find something interesting and informative. Without further ado, here's Richard Hanania. I am here with the man who killed DEI, Richard Hanania. You are one of the best people to talk to about this. What did the Trump admin do to kill DEI?
So they did a bunch of things. So they ended DEI in government. They basically said you have to have merit in government. You can't have goals related to DEI. It was very all comprehensive. And then the other thing they did that was really important was that they got rid of affirmative action in government contracting, which I wrote about in my book and which I recommended that they do. Government contracting, basically, it works as anyone who has a contract with the federal government and all their subcontractors has to have affirmative action. And through through the Department of Labor, the government has spelled out exactly what that means. That means keeping track of race and sex of your employees and even potential hires, looking for disparities and then setting goals and timetables in order to correct any disparities that you find. And basically, this is a big deal because this reached deep into the private sector, something like 25% of the workforce, because a lot of huge companies have government contracts and some of them aspire to have government contracts. And so the Trump administration ended that. They basically went the other direction and said you can't have affirmative action if you are a government contractor, and even told the government to start looking at like violations of DEI within universities and within the private sector and within nonprofits. Almost everything that you could think of that you can do on affirmative action / DEI / wokeness issues. The Trump administration so far in this week and a half or so has done them.
Yeah, and he can just do that. He can just do that by executive order.
There are some things you can just do by executive order. The affirmative action regime was created by executive order. It was created by Executive Order 11246 during the Johnson administration. The Nixon administration, Nixon signed an executive order creating DEI within the federal government. And so there are some things that are in legislation, and there are some things that just the government just does. And so things created by executive order generally can be undone by executive order. And it's the interpretation of the law is a funny thing, especially in the realm of civil rights. It could mean anything from affirmative action is mandatory to affirmative action is banned. And now we think the law says affirmative action is banned.
Yeah, that's crazy. This was one of the crazy things from reading your book was how much of it was just executive orders. Like any Republican could have just come in and undone this. It's amazing. So
Yeah,
what
I have not an entire chapter, but maybe an entire chapter, close to an entire chapter on why they didn't. So there's a lot of, I think, interesting history and lessons from that.
Yeah, and you should check out our third or second podcast for more about that. I'll have that clarified in the notes. What's left?
With wokeness, probably disparate impact is the huge one. That's the idea that you could find discrimination through the affirmative action executive order takes care of that a little bit, but there's still the interpretation and employment law. It really is when you think about these things. It really is just about winning elections and having the right judges and having the right administrators. Because within a Republican administration, it's an unnatural state where you couldn't imagine the federal government just being all in on gun control or pro choice, right? Because like Republican administrations have cared about that. So the federal government has not had a position explicit in every department on gun control or abortion. They did on DEI because it was treated as this thing that wasn't part of politics. It was just treated as like a best practices HR issue. And it's like Republicans even considering this a political issue is half the battle. It's amazing. It's just not even considered. So on wokeness, yeah, it's disparate impact. It's about having the right judges to make sure they don't undo it all. I think that I think I'm optimistic on this front. There is a kind of way that this stuff only succeeded because it slipped under the radar and it's never been popular and especially not popular with Republicans and Republican administrations. So yeah, this stuff is premature, maybe to simplistic to say we've won, but yeah, I can see what victory looks like.
So disparate impact, we just have to wait for the courts, or is there anything to do with
You
legislation
can
there?
do something by executive order. You can basically I just didn't get on the Trump administration's radar, but you can say within the federal government. Now, look, there's so much. It would almost be redundant given what the Trump administration has done because they basically say you can't have affirmative action and basically and all these different in the federal government. And if you can't have affirmative action, that's like the way of addressing disparate impact is to like so you've taken away all the tools for government contractors and the federal government to address disparate impacts. So you can have disparate impact, and you're not, and they're not going to do any consent decrees. A lot of this disparate impact stuff is about police departments and what they're doing, and they're not going to do any of that either. So I guess the one thing that remains in theory untouched is actual just Title VII civil rights lawsuits in employment. Then you still have disparate impact, but even there, you still have the pressure from the other direction with Republicans not wanting Republicans thinking it's Republican judges and government officials thinking that it's illegitimate to correct racial imbalances by engaging in disparate treatment of groups. And so the disparate impact thing is still there. It's a little bit, but you've gone so far with so much of the other stuff that it's a little bit redundant. But yeah, it would be good to kill it. It would be good for the courts to kill it because that would be more final than the administration taking whatever actions it wants. The courts probably would have to get involved for Title VII. You can do it. Look, it's together too. If you force it on the courts, you can get it to the courts, right? If the executive branch does something that gets litigated. But yeah, this is still the big thing for my book that was out there. But I think that's it's like a kind of a system with just a lot of redundancy. There's a lot of like reasons now why it makes sense for firms' self-interest and government self-interest not to discriminate in the old sense.
Well, congratulations. Oh, one more thing on this. Do we have an active case challenging that? I know we got Students for Fair Admissions decided somewhat recently. Is there anything like that?
I wondered why it was always there's always been high profile affirmative action cases in universities, and I think because conservatives pay a lot of attention to universities, intellectuals in general pay a lot of attention to universities, the disparate impact has to be raised as a defense. Someone has to sue you for disparate impact, and you have to say whatever this is the wrong standard, or that this standard is somehow illegitimate. So you can't like do the activism in that way. You have to defend yourself against disparate impact. So I'm sure there's thousands of civil rights cases at any one time that probably that depend
Or
on the
the
state.
idea with hold on. The idea with Students for Fair Admissions though is that by doing the racial balancing, like that's the injustice, right? So the defendants in that case was Harvard, the not prosecutors, but
Yeah,
the
that's
people
true. That's
bringing
how
the
civil rights.
case
Yeah, that's how the
was
law works too.
was the Students for Fair Admissions.
Yeah.
So is there not some way to force that and say like disparate impact is illegal for basically the same reasons they did
So the
there?
way disparate impact comes up is somebody sues you and says you gave an IQ test or whatever, and then you have to raise it as a defense. They accuse you based on disparate impact, and you have to say disparate impact is illegitimate as a defense, right? So you don't challenge disparate impact to take away disparate impact by suing someone.
Okay. I'm just struggling a little bit to understand this. What was the logic in Students for Fair Admissions then?
So student freedom of admissions is you are treating people disparate, and you're violating two grounds. 14th Amendment, you're violating constitutional rights just by treating people differently because your government institutions, in some cases, in the North Carolina case, although Harvard is not bound by the 14th Amendment. But then there's something called the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which also mirrors the language of the 14th Amendment, which the courts have always collapsed those into one thing. So the 14th Amendment says no discrimination based on race. In essence, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says government or government funded. That's how you get Harvard, because Harvard is
I
not
see.
a
Yeah,
14th Amendment, because they get the money through the federal government so that the Title VI applies to them. And then you say they're discriminating against us, right?
I see. Yeah.
And so the
And
way disparate impact comes up is I sue you, Walmart. I'm Al Sharpton, and I sue you, and I say you have some kind of practice, right, based on disparate impact, right? So I sue you. I'm the aggressor, the person who wants wokeness, who wants civil rights law. And then you could defend yourself by saying disparate impact is wrong somehow, which you wouldn't maybe do that directly because it's considered settled law, but it doesn't lend itself to the same kinds of activism as FFA v. Harvard.
yeah, you are one for one. Actually, you did have that other book, and I guess we did pull out of Afghanistan, and that was under Biden. So you're two for two. You had one win with Biden, one win with Trump. Now, what's your next project? What is the third thing in which you will revolutionize the law?
I just really, maybe I'm thinking about. I really am annoyed by the sign language interpreters. I think that this is just a big, ugly thing. I think it's in part of a larger story of disabilities law. I started researching disabilities law for my book on wokeness, and I was just like, wow, the whole thing should be just about the American with Disabilities Act. This is really bad. This is really out there. I don't know. Maybe something like that. I don't know. I have my elite human capital.
Explain to the audience what the Americans with Disabilities Act
It's the
does.
same thing as all the other stuff in that they're like you can't discriminate, and then it becomes this ridiculous thing where you have to remake every institution, right? So the Americans with Disabilities Act says basically you accommodate disabilities. What is a disability? What is an accommodation? What makes sense? It just all becomes litigated and all becomes a mess, and it's just you have these ability to sue, and there's just like these uh, lawyers who go around like looking at hotels. So even they look for hotels that don't have the
Yeah,
ramp in the
this is
right
where all
place.
the ramps come from. This is
There's all
where
the
like
all the
fat
handicapped
studies comes
parking
from.
spaces, and it was really bad. The Bush administration, oh my god, signed this bill, the amendments to the American with Disabilities. The Supreme Court tried to rein it in, the original law of 1990 or 1991, but then in 2007 or 2008, Bush signed amendments that the Supreme Court tried to say, okay, you have to bound it in some way. So like it was a case about eyeglasses, and there was some pilot who like couldn't see, it was I want to be a pilot, but I don't remember the details. Like he couldn't wear glasses or didn't want to wear glasses or something. And he said, I'm disabled. You have to take into account I have bad vision. And then the Supreme Court said that's too far. And then they went to the American Disabilities Act and said, no, you limited it by saying, because the court's logic was like the original Americans with Disabilities Act in the preamble to the law, they said that only they had a set amount of Americans, like 30 million or 40 million Americans are disabled, something like that. And the Supreme Court was like, okay, if you consider people with glasses, that would put it way over. And then the Congress goes and says, we want to overrule the court and say, no, there's no limit on how many people in America could potentially be disabled, right? And Bush signs this. I think it passes almost unanimously through both houses of Congress, and it makes disability law like even more ridiculous. I don't know if this is going to be my issue, but I've been thinking about it a little bit. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, so this is a law, and so to fight it, you have to pass a piece of legislation.
they all laws have things that are up to interpretation and things in the court. So there's always like different things you could do. Yeah, but I'm working on the Elite Human Capital book. It's more like a framework for understanding the world than it is like a specific policy approach. I do think that there's like a danger of right wingers starting to become like socialists basically, and so that's some things I write about too. So yeah, there's a lot of potential. I don't have the Elite Human Capital is the next book. It doesn't have direct policy implications. After that, we'll see.
Yeah, the Elite Human Capital book. That's really interesting. What is elite human capital?
It's the idea. So you have this class of people who are just like they end up ruling in like every kind of free society. There are people who are unusually geared towards status rather than money. They're intelligent, but they're idealistic, right? And the idea is that this is like a kind of natural ruling class if you don't do something to disrupt it. Like if you're not like Putin and you arrest all the elite human capital, or you're not China and you spy on them and you make sure like they all fall in line.
I
And
think you
so
can argue that China is still ruled by elite human capital.
In a way, I don't know. It depends on is she. It's not really the framework isn't built for this, but it's like is Xi Jinping elite human capital? Like I've heard people say he's dumb. I don't know, but I've heard people say he's plagiarized. I haven't heard this. I haven't heard. I don't know. I haven't looked into this, but it's yeah. China is the kind of system where yeah, it's a complicated case, but it's more of a
Sorry, I
framework for
interrupted you. Go on.
it's a little bit of it's a framework for understanding the West. So you do have this educational polarization thing, which is just like people who went to college are more likely to be Democrats than that has been the case in recent history. And then you do have this like intelligence education, but you do have like these cultural differences. And I think there are these liberal conservative differences are as interesting as differences between like different regions of the world. They're just like everything from how conservatives and liberals seek truth to how they communicate to how the hive mind works to how they change their mind on different things. They're separate and they're worthy of investigation. I think it comes down to the idea that liberals are the people elite human capital, which is not always liberals. It is they do there's mostly overlap in this country, but there doesn't necessarily always have to be the case. Elite human capital is generally smarter, more idealistic, status driven or meaning driven rather than money driven, and that basically creates many of the truth seeking institutions, whether they're succeeding or failing, that we know about that are important and prominent in our societies. And yeah, this class obviously has flaws too, but it's a kind of a framework for understanding political differences and just democracy versus dictatorship and how institutions function when they're supposed to.
Yeah, I think a good way to lead into this is talking about the problem that it solves, that the book solves, which is I think a lot of conservatives and libertarians have asked themselves these questions. If you're smart, you can make a lot of money in a market society, and you're probably paying more taxes. You have a lot of opportunity in front of you. You're some of the people most restricted by regulation. Like, why aren't you all just the most libertarian, most conservative people on the planet? Like, why doesn't that just happen?
That's so this framing, yeah, this framing is a little bit. This is like a kind of a adjacent issue because I still think elite human capital is generally seeks out its own interests and will take financial opportunities when they come to them. It's just this kind of idea of like class interest as driving political attitudes is kind of a iffy concept that doesn't do a lot to explain the world. I think the question that conservatives and libertarians often ask is like, why are they like this? Like, why are liberals like
Yeah.
this? Like, and I think
Why
there are
it
two.
asks, what are the libs? Few people ask, why are the libs?
What are the libs? Why are the libs? Yes,
Yeah.
that's a good framing. Yeah, and they're too negative. They do have these flaws, and I have a chapter that's going to be on the flaws of elite human capital, and I do think there needs to be a synthesis. So why are they like this? Why do they have these flaws? And why do they get these things right? Like why do we even have truthful media at all? Like why do we have like science? Okay, financial incentives, but there's like barely any financial incentives in academia. It doesn't really work like a market works. A bunch of committee likes you and they hire you, and they don't make money if they hire the right person, usually directly, a very indirect way. Where the universities gets more grants or whatever. It's a very, very indirect way that these institutions function on self-interest. And same with the New York Times. Could it if the New York Times went became like that Rob if they became like Aaron Rupert or something and they were just doing that all day, couldn't the New York Times be more profitable? I think they would. They don't do that though for a reason. They don't go full resistance propaganda 24 hours a day. And like, why newspapers? Why science? Why academia in the first place? These are interesting questions. I don't think like the idea we know why firms, why businesses. That's easy. Like people just want to make money and they go they trade and they find ways to do that. That's easy. I think these other things. I think it's relatively underdeveloped why we have these like institutions that are don't run directly on the profit motive.
And what's the answer to that question? Why do we have those institutions?
Because when you reach a point of historical development in a somewhat free society, you have people come together who are smart and idealistic, and they develop norms, the kind of norms that smart idealistic people develop, in which they start to signal virtue rather than power or money or control, right? And so, like a person who's an academic, they write a paper that changes the way we see the business cycle or whatever. They might indirectly help them make some money because they'll get a promotion, but they'll get an extra $15,000 a year as a professor or whatever. But that's not really what's driving the work. They can, if they were driven by money, they would go do something else. And it's the same with journalists. It's the same with a lot of people in the nonprofit sector, for better or worse. These people are part of a community. There's sub communities, or like anthropologists are a community, but then there's all the community of just like people who are like smart and all read the New York Times or whatever. So now it's like very correlated with being on the left politically, hasn't always been that strongly associated with it. But yeah, so the people basically are not like right wingers don't have status, but it's different. It's more directly and tangentially related to apes or baboons. It's like it is the elite human capital title. It is it's I think it's like one of my tweets. It's both deadly serious and tongue in cheek at the same time. It's like elite human capital. Yes, these people are elite and they are in a sense better than other people, but it's also like they screw a lot of things up, which is why I'm not a Democrat, or I'm not a liberal. That needs to be explained too. So are they really that elite? They've gotten some things seriously wrong and are mistaken on some of the most important like social and political issues of our time. So I'm gonna try my best to develop a balance. I think I've been pro elite human capital in my messaging up to this point, just because I hate rightoids and I'm trying to annoy them. Somehow I keep coming home to rightoid politics, even going to Trump, and so there's a reason for that there, because there is a balance that exists in my head that I'm trying to communicate to people.
Yeah. It might be really interesting to look at the versions of right wing elite human capital in history. I remember Tyler Cow. This is a deep cut. Tyler Cowan went on the podcast with the Reason folks, with Liz Wolfe and Zach Weissenmuller, and he base and they asked him about the kind of the kind of intellectual libertarianism movement with Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and all of the Austrians, and just a lot of interesting academic and like media work from a libertarian perspective. What do you make of that moment?
Yeah. So historically, yeah, historical right wing elite human capital movements. I think that intellectuals who punched above their weight. I think like Milton Friedman, the law and economics people, like Judge Richard Posner, libertarians in general, have really done an excellent job for the same many of the same reasons of influencing policy, for many of the same reasons that liberals do, because they're smart people who care about ideas, who are focused on those ideas, that are often, ironically in their case, because they love markets, but nonetheless, they prioritize ideas and spreading ideas more relative to most people do, relative to making money. And yeah, that has been like remarkably successful. People think libertarians like don't matter or are irrelevant. No, I think they're one of the groups, if you're going to categorize groups by ideology, that punches above its weight given its rootedness in public opinion and like self-interest. Like you look at the interest groups, like there's not a lot of interest groups with a direct stake in libertarian policy. Usually they want a subsidy, or they want some industry wants some help from the government. And so given the barriers it faced in terms of public opinion and in terms of interest group pressure, libertarians do an amazing job of translating their preferences into policy. So I think libertarianism is like a good case. And it's like you could go back further, like the 19th century, like the standard elite human capital thing was to be a classical liberal. The idea that the
Right.
socialism didn't come until later. So, if we call that, I do think that, so libertarianism is a branch of kind of elite human capital. What does it form? What does it naturally do? Like liberalism, left socialism, libertarianism, probably not blood and soil nationalism or anti-vax or like religious fundamentalists. Some of these people do have, what I argue in my book is there can be elite human capital of like theocrats or whatever, but usually you need like a closed social system for that to work. So like you have to prosecute heretics either like through government or through like social norms, right? You could have this intellectual movement of Protestants or Catholics or whatever. It's not going to do well. It's not going to dominate society in the way that liberalism or even libertarianism will at its best moments, because the arguments don't hold up. But I think it's just, as part of it, it's just like these like conservative, like non-libertarian ideas just don't hold up to scrutiny very well, and they don't naturally appeal to, I think, smart and idealistic people. So yeah, there is like a kind of there is a classical liberal elite human capitalism, elite human capital, classical liberalism. That's natural. I think it's probably more common for elite human capital to be more pro market than the masses than it is for it to be socialist. There's some data in my book that I cite for that, and it's generally socially liberal. But as far as right wing elite human capital, that is not libertarianism, but some kind of blood and soil nationalism or something like or theocratic in its orientation. Theocratic is, I would say, just religious to be more neutral. That's much less common, and I argue that's like kind of unnatural state of affairs.
Yeah, so elite human capital, it's more Hillary Clinton than Bernie Sanders. It's
Yeah, the Bernie Sanders. It depends on the country. I think there are some places where probably the human capital does lean more socialist.
yeah, there were many socialist intellectuals, and so
Of course, I think elite human capital does correct over time in the general course of history. Like socialism is not that popular among elites as it once was. I was posting about Paul Ehrlich today. Like they don't talk like Paul Ehrlich anymore, right? There is like progress here. Nobody's saying like, you're all going to starve to death in 10 years. Even the global warming alarmists like are generally not saying like crazy stuff like that. And so there is a kind of corrective mechanism. Was it crazy to be a socialist in 1890? Maybe. Like it's different in 2025, and you need to have like totalitarian. You need to have a university like with like hate speech codes and like a monoculture, or you need some kind of third world dictatorship where you just tell people to do. Otherwise, smart people are going to shift away from this. Maybe they still come out left on economics, but socialism, like no, one crazy guy from Vermont is basically all we can take.
yeah, I think that there is. I do think this is a point Tyler Cowen makes a lot, but I do think we don't give as much credit to elites on what they have corrected over. I think he had a review of Patrick Deneen's book where he was like, "The worst elites in history, really? What
Yeah,
about Stalin?"
he
Something
goes,
like
yeah,
that,
what's under the
right?
citation needed, I think, or something like that. It's yeah, I think we need a little more explanation of
And
that.
there's a really good point there, which is, I don't think our current elites are as bad as Stalin. I think they are, in fact, better than Stalin.
I think for the people who led us into World War One, I think our elites are better than that. They didn't do anything that crazy.
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe a point that can win a lot of people over to be more favorable to elites who are
Yeah,
anti-interventionists. As
having
bad as
said
you think, as much as you think this might be starting World War III, we've improved from literally starting World War One.
yeah, start World War Three. Yeah, World War One is incredible. It's incredible how these people just sleepwalked into it. Not really sleepwalked into it. I think Germany was a little bit more was more of kind of intention to do this, but the way that they were able to fight this war for a very long time. Yeah, Tyler. Another thing he said was basically you could understand intellectuals with left versus right, but you could understand them also as trying to raise the status of elites or bring down the status of elites. And he mentioned like Matt Stoller as like trying to reduce their status. He mentioned me as trying to improve it, which is just like a very funny role for me to play. But yeah, I think that's right. I think that I don't know. It's part of the project is I want to flatter them because we need them to like be better. What is it telling the idiots, like the masses out there? You guys are awesome. What does that do? You're gonna just fill them with stupid. They're gonna think that they're smart when they're not, and they're gonna become more arrogant and be able to influence policy in ways that they shouldn't because they're ignorant. Yeah, some people say, I don't know, do you want to make liberals more elites more full of themselves because a lot of them are like Fauci worshippers, trust the science, we're already kind of perfect. But I could almost think if they made their sense of superiority, their elitism more explicit, they would not be what they are, right? They would just like on just by vibe and aesthetic, they would become more right wing, right? It's a kind of a thing where it's like there's a kind of like elite like egalitarianism. Oh, I'm just a professor of master's public health. I'm looking at the science and I'm listening to disempowered voices, and there's like just slimy kind of elitism, but also justified based in egalitarianism. And so it would be something different, like elitism being was
Yeah,
okay.
if they stop feeling so guilty about themselves.
They would be probably make smarter decisions. It would be like a less neurotic kind of elite, and it would draw less neurotic people into these positions of power and influence.
Yeah, there is something about that elite status sort of hinges, not always, but at least in part hinges on being self-deprecating and in some cases on being more neurotic. Yeah, I do think that's a negative
Yeah.
selection
It's very
effect.
interesting. It's if you talk to like my experience in academics, like political science is what I know most, but I think it's probably similar in a lot of fields. Like they're very narrow in their focus, and this is the way academia has developed. And
Yes.
so, like, they're in a way very humble. Like, they don't do these things where they're not like Curtis Yarvin telling you like a new kind of government we're going to form or something like that. They don't do that, but it's just like they outsource everything to like the hive mind, except maybe in their one little area of expertise. And there's like a kind of aesthetic of like passivity. I think it leads to like safetyism and risk aversion, and it's just like a kind of way of being and thinking about the world. And so, like, they're humble, but they're like totalitarian in their thinking because it's just there's a kind of like a settled science or like a way of seeing the world that is just completely correct. And yeah, it's a certain kind of person. But if you're not like that, I think that there's like more ability to like think for yourself and just, but it starts with the idea that like there is like something beyond the hive mind. I think a lot of these people can't even conceive of that.
Yeah, and this has just been an obsession of mine, an obsession of my writings about philosophy, is that something went really wrong when you ask yourself the question, what is the purpose of discussion or debate or publishing? And I think there are two schools of thoughts. One is the point is to agree. The point is to create social harmony, to get to a point where people are not arguing anymore. And there's another where it's the point is to disagree. The point is to hash it out, be aggressive, make your point, be blunt about it, and give evidence. And at the end of the day, a lot of the time, it'll turn out that one person is wrong and the other is right. And that person might even admit that they're wrong. But the point is not to make everyone kind of act in harmony. The point is not to get to a point where everyone is singing from the same hymnal. And there was some point in time, I can't really identify it, maybe it was more gradual, that academia the went from being disagreement first to agreement first. And that I don't know how to undo that problem.
Yeah. And so some people would say, like Corey Clark types would say, this is basically feminization. And yeah, I think there's something to that, that just women, this is the way women communicate more than men. And they're frankly less interested in truth and more interested in social harmony. There's something to that. But then there's also just been the selection effect of the kind of people who go into universities. I don't know.
Yeah,
They
I know
might
a
be.
lot of men who are like this too. So it's certainly not just women.
Yeah, and yeah, and it could be just part of the expansion of higher education. There's just more people who are conformist and want social harmony rather than people who are like prickly and care about truth. It'd be like a classicist of the 19th century or something, or like some of these people, like Richard Burden was a British guy in the 19th century, amazing, studied foreign languages. These people were involved in colonial projects with the British Empire. They were going off living in these third world remote locations and traveling and learning everything. And that's not the kind of route to being an academic today. And yeah, it is a kind of yeah, and I think another thing here is the gap in money, like the earnings of like academia and the private sector for smart people, I think has gotten up over time. So I think it's become more kind of status oriented rather than because you have to give up a lot more money now because the opportunity cost is much higher in order to be an academic of some kind. So yeah, there's a lot of different things going on. As we're talking about academia, it's the extreme example of elite human capital and like all its strengths and dysfunctions. But this applies to journalism and applies to other things too.
Yeah, although academia is remarkable because I think it signifies, at its best, it signifies what elite human capital, it signifies all of the advantages of elite human capital. I think academia, in times and in places where it's functioning and it is disagreeing and is conducting real experiments with real evidence, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it still works
Um,
to a large or decent extent. Yeah, and depending on the field and depending on what you're looking at. Yeah, absolutely. The STEM kinds of patents and the kind of inventions, even in the stuff Razib Khan writes about, is amazing. The stuff that they've discovered in the last 10 years about deep human history. That's all academia. There's no private sector interest that is going to make it worth it for people to do this kind of research. It's just amazing for human knowledge, and this still happens like all the time.
yeah. Another aspect of elite human capital is, yeah, there's something really interesting here where it's much higher status to be fighting for someone else. And there's a kind of racial dimension to this, there's a kind of class trader dimension to this, but a lot of elite human capital
movements seem to really take pride in fighting for someone else. So not fighting in their own interest or their group's own interest, but fighting for some group in some way that doesn't benefit themselves. Um,
It's more
what's
general than that.
happening
I would
there?
I would say elite human capital
Why
is
is
more
that?
moral. It's just elite human capital is more moral and has a kind of more broader social circle of empathy. So it's more natural for elite human capital to say, I care about the underdog, the person who is being harmed or being oppressed. You can argue about whether they actually are oppressed or not. Well, it's like the most simple, primitive person is I just care about myself. And it's funny when they make racism into an ideology. It's interesting to talk to Jared Taylor because it's like what you're arguing is it's just like my emotions are this, and it's not even based in virtue. It's just like I guess it is a kind of virtue. I guess it's a duty to people close to you, and it's more the sympathetic form. But most smart idealistic people don't find that convincing. I like group X because I am group X. That doesn't appeal to a lot of people. Dumb people, yes, who have nothing else but their group membership, yes, but like smart idealistic people, no.
So I think our mutual friend Rob Henderson might say that it comes from a place of expressing like how well off you are. Someone who has to worry about their own interest, they're not elite. Someone who has to worry about their own interest, or sorry, yeah, someone who has to worry about their own interest is not elite. Someone who doesn't have to worry about it and in fact can spend all of their time fighting for some other group's interest. They're signaling how well off they already are. Do you think there's any truth there?
Yeah, sub psychologically, this is what's going on. It's like a cry for help versus a expression of stress. It's not
Yeah, I
really
do think
a
it's going by this argument, it is an expression of strength, right?
yeah,
And it's
yeah.
an expression of like very real strength.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an honest signal. It's a reliable signal. And yeah, is the person who is posting all day their racist stuff. Is that person's probably not effectively fighting for their own interest either. They should probably just go exercise or something. But they are expressing like their status in the social hierarchy. And this is what like people don't get, I guess, sometimes about like racism, like why it's so it's not just because the liberals will cancel you. It's just like people find it disgusting. People just find it. Iglesias talked about the other day how there's a story where some guy was like quoted in an article saying, well, now we can say retarded again, but it was like he was quoted anonymously, and it's wait a minute, you can't say retarded apparently because you like you're worried about the social consequences, not that the Trump administration is going to come after you or something. And these things exist for a reason. There is a what I want to write. I want to write a piece. I'm thinking about my women's tears follow up. I'm gonna be like learning to
In
love
defense
women's
of women's
tears.
tears.
Yeah, learning to love women's intuitions because I've had a new. It's an article. It's like my second most well read article ever. And usually when you have an article that's really successful, sometimes you think about following up on it because there's a lot of interest in it. So you want to give people something else to think about. And that one I never followed up on. It has no sequel, and most articles have some kind of sequel or they're part of a series. And that one stands alone. And I think it stands alone because I moved in like the opposite direction and started to really respect women. And so I've got to have something where it's got to be like it'll be part of a series, but where I argue with myself and say here are some reasons to respect women's intuitions
That'll be a very fun one, both for you and for
for the
the
world.
crowd, for the audience reaction. Yeah, women's tears are honest and good.
Yeah, women's tears. Learning to drink the sweet nectar of women's tears. I don't know. We could find some kind of funny. We could find some funny headline there. I'll have to think about it.
Yeah, another aspect that you might want to push back against is utopianism, right? First of all, do you think it's even fair to characterize elite human capital as wanting a utopia, wanting a perfectly rational system more than
It's
average?
This is like Thomas Sowell's.
Yeah, exactly.
Either it is, but I think as liberalism has become more neurotic, I think it's become like a drive towards like dystopia, like having to see like the negative in everything. So it's yeah, I
Well, it's
like,
both. It's like the world is going to end, but we need the centrally planned state to
but
stop it from
the
ending.
idea the world is going to end and everything is so terrible seems to so predominant. Greta Van Thustra, does she seem motivated by idealism more? or the idea that everything is terrible and needs to be. It seems like the everything is terrible. Same thing with wokeness with
Yeah.
like George Floyd. They didn't even give you like Ta-Nehisi Coates goes out of his way to say, "Oh, nothing can ever get better." It's like a very
Yeah,
kind
it's,
of
it's very
gloomy.
black pilled.
It's just very just focused on like the oppression and the pain that these people feel. When I say idealistic, it doesn't necessarily mean utopian. It just means like caring about ideas and thinking a lot about ideas, which can be dystopian in this orientation. And
Yeah,
especially
I think even Tanisi would say he cares about explaining the world, figuring it out in a way where
yeah,
everything logically makes sense.
even truth for finding truth for the sake of finding truth is also idealism. It doesn't necessarily even have to have an instrumental purpose. Often it doesn't.
Yeah, version. They're not necessarily utopian, but they are concerned about ideas. They are concerned about putting everything together. Do you still think that presents a risk? Like you'd look at like the FDA as maybe one version where they want everything to make sense and be filed properly according to procedure, but this ends up backfiring. Do you think that that's legitimate?
That's a problem. Yeah, I think that's what I think. Elite human
Yeah, and,
capital.
and and that it's due to elite human capital and due to them wanting to logically process everything.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to write. Yeah, there's a couple like flaws. I think we can have a characterization of a system of flaws of elite human capital. So one is pathological altruism. Like you don't get that with like low human capital. You don't find that because they don't have altruism at all. So it's the criminals, they must all be misunderstood or whatever. So you have that. You have
Yeah.
this pathological. Whoever's complaining the most, whoever's most dysfunctional, they're worthy of our concern. Historically, I would argue that it's been a good sort of heuristic to say whoever seems oppressed probably is oppressed. Like in a society with slavery, that makes sense, or a society with feudalism, it's who's oppressed. That's like an easy question, right? And then you apply that to modern society where like poor people are poor because they make bad choices or because they're low IQ and they're not contributing much to society. That's completely different, despite opportunities they might have. So you do have this kind of pathological altruism, but then you have this death by proceduralism, right? Where it's just like low human capital trends towards power and cults of personality. It's whatever Trump says, that's what the entire conservative movement's going to be. Dictatorships work like that. Elite human capital has rules and regulations, and they're supposed to be impersonal. But they can, then you get kludgocracy. You get these kind of problems where there's all these rules and regulations are on top of each other. There's nobody there. There's no part of elite human capital. It's non-dictatorial. It's more democratic in its orientation. There's no one Caesar or one person who's able to cut through that and consider the entire system holistically. These things reinforce one another. Pathological altruism, people find ways to game the system. I think that a lot of the stuff, the abundance agenda people talk about, it's a result of this. And there's like a neuroticism that's like triumphed that is, I think, related to these proceduralism. It's like safetyism. So we need neurotics. It attracts neurotics. It is the system is built is built like for them, basically, not explicitly or not on purpose, but just like they're able to exploit it better because the people who'd be very good at editing Wikipedia. Just thinking of that article by our friend Tracing Woodgrains. And so, yeah, this is, I think, yeah, this proceduralism, I think it's one of the problems of elite human capital. It's the flip side of Caesarism, like dictatorship, like right wingers. It's funny, right wingers like love the idea of a dictator, even when they're behaving like, even when Trump is powerless, they like love the idea. Even he was relatively.
Yeah, Curtis went as far as saying he'd rather have the blue Caesar, he'd rather have Gavin Newsom take absolute power.
Yeah, and then liberals, even though when their system is authoritarian, they still deny it, right? It's always like everything is democratic and everything is equal, and we're just following the rules, which is true to a certain extent. But yeah, there's a kind of just elite human capital orientation towards signaling that you're democratic and open and considering all perspectives.
Yeah. I had this article about because all of these post liberals, a lot of them really hate John Locke. And I had this take that there was something really that went really wrong with how people thought about John Locke and how people thought about democracy more broadly, which is that the way politics was done was that when people negotiated, they were negotiating about like a tangible exchange of things, like earmarks, another $1 billion to like West Virginia or something like that, right? And now they talk about it in terms of rules. They talk about it in terms of putting rules on everyone that everyone has to obey.
Mhm.
And The reason why this is such a problem is that when you're just exchanging things, theoretically, there's some deadweight loss there of taxing and then exchanging things, and that's inefficient. Theoretically, there's some loss there, but it just pales in comparison to the deadweight loss of taking these rules and applying them to everyone. And so you get these systems that are meant to exchange essentially like power for money and create some sort of redistribution in a genuinely positive way. And you change that into a system that is very neurotic and very like veto based.
Wait,
You
so you're
change
saying
that
Locke's
into a
original
vetocracy where
concept of
people where everyone where the main thing that people are doing is like banning other people to make them worse off.
so are you saying that the original conception of democracy under like Locke and early Enlightenment thinkers was it was more transactional
Yes,
and
it was
it was
extremely
it was always meant to
transactional.
be it was always meant to be less idealistic, and then it became more about we're gonna have these rules that make society better off. Is that it?
It was both, right? You had the Constitution and you had the way Congress was negotiated, and it was always struck as a balance between the political interests of states. It was very explicitly about that, and it was also about the idealism, right? So what really changed was this idea of like homogeneity, of everyone has to obey, and everyone has to obey in this like very bureaucratic procedural way. You can say that like the First Amendment is a rule, and it is, right? It's literally amendment to the Constitution, and it's something where we all have to have free speech, or we are all guaranteed the right of free speech. But in practice, that's very different than we all have to abide by the procedures of the FDA.
Yeah. I don't know. I know. Are we describing different kinds of there are these differences of just quantity or quality, right? Because you have a rule that says First Amendment, and you have we've always had courts in like American history, Anglo-American tradition, and that's like rules. But then you have like the administrative state, and you have these different kinds of regulations. But this just seems like a spectrum of like rule following.
It's the distinction between positive and negative rights. Like the rule that states have to guarantee free speech. I guess it's a rule for like the government, but in general, it's a negative right. It's something that in their philosophy comes before the state, is a natural right that is guaranteed to all American citizens. And the FDA is not that, right? The FDA is not a negative right, it's a positive right. And in creating that positive, it's creating a mandate that people have to do a certain thing, which is to do all these reports and so on and so forth. So you go from things being essentially the only rules are expanding or guaranteeing negative rights to demanding these positive rights.
Okay, so yeah, this is a question. This is like it's a question of sort of default rule, default or sort of way of thinking about
Yes, exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
what society can do. Yeah, that's about yeah. Is that the same question as democracy, or is that something? Is how does this fit into democracy? Just democracy was predicated on negative rights, and now when it became predicated on positive rights, that's when the switch happens, and that's when that was the road to hell.
Yeah, when and society was not always, you can say it was more libertarian, but it was not purely libertarian. What would happen is that you would have redistribution through basically like earmarks, through bargaining, through like just resource transfers. And when it came to rights, though, that was the language of negative rights, right? So in some ways you had positive rights, but that wasn't created through like banning things and applying universal rules. That was created by services. It was created by providing a thing, a dollar amount to a person accountable.
Okay.
That's the evolution.
Hmm. Okay.
Okay, we were
I mean,
talking about idealism and elites. There's there was an interesting tweet the other day, which was something like, it was a tweet by Oliver Traldi that was something like, I should give more context about this. So there was a big Twitter cycle about working at Panda Express. Do you
yeah,
remember this?
yeah. I wrote about this. About it,
Okay.
or I just did a podcast. Anyways, I wrote some stuff about it. Yeah, I at least tweeted about it.
Yeah. So there was this big news cycle about Panda Express, about right wing posters or intellectuals or something not wanting to work at Panda Express and wanting to have better job opportunities and not wanting to take entry level jobs is the way some people would frame it. And Oliver Trolley had this very interesting tweet that was something like, this sounds a lot like the left wing grad students complaining about their job opportunities. Sounds
Yeah.
a lot like the same kind of belief that they should be guaranteed to do something high status, and make money doing the thing that is high status.
Yeah, yeah. So this was the also the discussion whether people we should call these people the woke, and this blended into the Indian immigration discussion. So that was
Yeah.
before the Panda Express discussion.
Yeah.
It was sort
We're
of this.
doing the entire Twitter history archive here. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was like, yeah, that was all that was within quick succession of one another. Yeah, and so like the woke right idea, I do like it. I cringe to say woke right, but it is true that it's like the same, I think, psychological dynamics in so many different ways. It's like these people just they're lazy, they want something handed to them. They want it often based on identity or having the right beliefs. And it is like a kind of miserable state of affairs. So yeah, I do think that there's it's very funny. Like the left wing ones, they're at least like real life communities. I guess they're living in college towns and they're grad students and so forth, or they're living in New York City or wherever they happen to be living. And this is just like purely LARP, like purely just you're sitting in your house refusing to leave. Like you didn't even go through the trouble of applying to some shitty grad school and going to some fake, getting some fake degree. You're just sitting there and saying,
You mean
"Deliver
the
me
right
the
wing
food."
version is just LARP?
Huh?
You mean the right wing version is
Yeah,
LARP?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. It's just
Yeah.
like I sit here on my computer and I've done nothing. Now come bring me my job. And I'm offended if anyone tells me anything otherwise. And before there were immigrants and before there was feminism, I didn't even have to put on pants and I could have the world delivered to me. It's a kind of just an absurd kind of a caricature almost of entitlement and just laziness, right? It's a kind of a very kind of a unique thing that's uniquely ugly. It's just terrible to see.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think this might have actually been a quote tweet from you, but I saw someone like the original poster, not you, was saying like they were doing the characteristically woke thing of just repeating the same thing 10 times.
Yeah, they do that too. Yes, I made fun of them. What were they doing? I don't know. There was a lot of this stuff. One of them, they said Joe Lonsdale. They told him read the room. I'm like, they actually said read the room. Like when Joe Lonsdale said something that offended these rightists. Yeah, it does go down to the very language, like the very exact phrases. You think they would avoid those phrases at least because they're negatively polarized against it, but no, it's just like they're adopting the same language. It's incredible. And these people are like not like we shouldn't like I don't know. It's weird. It's in a certain sense like they're not like real, but in another sense they are because like all these young right wing people working in the Trump administration or like staffing are like online and their lives are like determined by what they see online. And so it's partly it's not real. This version of it is not real, but there's like all these people in real life who are sympathetic towards this kind of thought, even if they're not as big of losers as like a lot of these add-ons are.
I think that might be true for the H1Bs. I think that's not really true for the
Panda
Panda
Express.
Express thing,
Yeah.
because the people in the Trump administration are like by definition they have jobs, right?
Yeah,
And they climbed out of the hole by themselves, or maybe not
but
by
I did
themselves,
see
but
at
like,
least one person who I knew who was like involved in Republican circles who was like very sympathetic to the non who was anonymous posting sympathetic to the anti Panda Express position. And
yeah,
so
and like Bannon obviously has a job, reportedly
Bannon
quite
has a job, but
wealthy.
Bannon is yeah, they have jobs. I'm not saying that they're like they're psychological. They're like I don't know. They're like black people who are like middle class, but sympathize with the ghetto. It's you put on your pants and you get married before having children, but like you love like the real guy is like the ghetto
The
thug.
real N words.
Yeah, it's like them. It's like these people, like they have jobs, but like the real person is like the person who just, puts out racial slurs all day on Twitter. That's like the authentic life.
So are they not like fighting for other people?
For losers, yeah, whose only distinguishing feature is like they're racist, and so therefore they sympathize with them. There is a more broader, JD Vance maybe has a broader version of this, where it's like my redneck people who are not even not online. So that's a different thing. But then there's people who just identify with online weirdos. Like that actually is like their community.
Yeah. What do you think of, not to single anyone out here, but Indians who are very pro or very anti H1B, who are aggressively anti H1B and are like fighting for the other people, fighting for the oppressed white guys? Is that elite human capital behavior?
Yeah, it's a kind of a weird it is a weird thing. It's like you can't it's easy to say they're just kissing up to people. I think that they're like I don't know if that's it. I think it's more along the lines of they have like similar concerns where like they're anti woke or anti feminist or whatever, and they build like they build like a community in their head, even if they might not be completely accepted to it. Like this is my tribe, and then they can justify anything, even like people hating them. It's oh they were oppressed for being white for so long and they're just freaking out. And yes, they have a right to control their borders. And so you could do that, but it's ridiculous because in the end, their allies do detest them. And they detest Indians more than any other group. It's hostility towards
There is a certain other group
yeah,
that they
it's
detest.
overlap. It's overlap, but it is yeah, how to think about the
Yeah, are
sort
they
of
more anti-Semitic or more anti-Indian?
I'm thinking about the Venn diagram here and I think so you have Jews who like hate Indian like Laura Loomer is like very anti-Indian, right? And also
Jewish?
Loomer, yes, that's what I'm saying. She's hysterical
Okay.
about it. Yeah, everyone's anti-Semite. So she's like, you have that. You have Jews who are. I think these people are like more organic to MAGA, like to be a Jewish pro-Israel anti-Indian. I think that's organic to MAGA. And then it's if you are just this guy who hates, if you hate Jews, you're not going to have any influence. You're not going to be close to the president or getting close to the president the way Loomer was. And so anti-Indian hate is like more mainstream, and there is like a way like a Jew could be like a full MAGA in good standing. I don't think you could be an Indian and be a MAGA in in full standing. Any Indian who is not completely masochistic, they're going to have a problem with, right? They don't like Vivek, they don't like Nikki Haley. I think it's partly just because
Yeah, I
they
saw someone trying to cancel Cash Patel for being
yeah,
Indian.
Cash is a MAGA. Cash is a MAGA in good standing. He's just pure MAGA, and this is just a kind of online thing. But it's very hard. Cash Patel's like
Yeah, and
not a
even then, some of the Anons, they went after Cash Patel.
yeah. It is partly just like racism is like much stupider than you think because it's like Indians look different and Jews often look the same, and that's what they're going off of. They're going off of phenotype. I do think that is mostly that. Never
Yeah,
overestimate low human capital. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one.
yeah, fair enough. There was something that I think was interesting and this will be linked below your article, I think part 2, where you had the chart of elite human capital thinking. And I'm not sure what I think about this, but something that was really interesting is that you identified the mystical and spiritual thinking as something that like low human capital is more likely to do. And I think that might be true in the present, but I think on one hand might not necessarily be historically true, and on the other hand, I'll just be honest. I care about the spiritual and mystical thinking. I think believing in a kind of divine rights or that morality will be judged by someone other than the state or someone other than like the people in front of you, that makes the world a better place. And I
That's an
worry that elite human
instrumental.
capital is not spiritual enough.
So if you think about ancient Rome or something, where it's yeah, the Christians were probably elite human capital. They were very idealistic, and like the Romans were just unthinking, and I guess spiritual in their own way, but not as much as the Christians. More concerned
Yeah,
with
there were Roman thinkers, but less of
well,
a
Christianity itself
tradition.
was like yeah, was something new and different. Yeah, but I think it is like one of the clearest kind of patterns in the world that you could find and educated, like more smarter and educated people are less religious. I think that's clear. And then mystical, you can expand that beyond religion to like horoscopes and intergalactic demons or whatever, like Alex Jones types and Tucker Carlson types believe in. And so that's I think a human universal. I think there's a simple explanation of why that is. Just like most spirituality is not true, and maybe it was like it's another one of those things where it's 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, maybe like Richard Dawkins always says this, like God creator was like plausible before Darwin. And then after Darwin, like it became less plausible. And I think that's got to be true to some extent in the sense that society, like there's more and more that has been explained. And then atheists would say the rest is just God of the gaps. And so I think the case for atheism, I don't know, maybe some people think, I don't know, like maybe quantum mechanics or string theory or something, maybe. I think it's the historical trend is like Darwinism, and we discovered the Big Bang Theory is towards atheism. And maybe like recent weird stuff will make you maybe increases the odds of some kind of religion being correct by a little bit, maybe. But I think historically, like religion has become less plausible than more plausible as time goes on.
Yeah, belief has certainly reflected that for better or for worse. Um, yeah, I don't. Do you think that there's you know if people find meaning in more kind of introspective ways or believe that they'll be judged in heaven instead of earth, do you think that can lead them to be like less neurotic and less totalitarian?
Less totalitarian, maybe. Yeah, less neurotic, definitely. I think there is. It's weird. It's not like you could just choose, I want to be religious because I want to be less neurotic. Maybe you can choose that. I think most people come at it in a different way. Maybe they're driven by their emotions and they find that a religion is fulfilling. It gives them, you could have a spiritual interpretation of that or a psychological interpretation of that. It's like why this stuff survives and why it's adaptive, right? It probably I'm sure it correlates with being more likely to get married and stay married and have children and these things that are just adaptive from an individual perspective and adaptive from an evolutionary perspective. So that I think is correct. Elite human capital is not necessarily always adaptive for individuals, for society maybe more, but like for individuals especially, like the connection between like elite human capital and being adaptive in terms of like I don't know, evolutionary fitness or like the way people more commonly think about it, just like being happy and living a fulfilling, content life. The correlation might be negative between being elite human capital and that. It is people are drawn sometimes to idealism out of neuroticism, like they need
Hmm.
they're tortured by their thoughts. They need to like a way to make sense of the world, or they need to like latch on to some elite culture or like something to make themselves feel better about themselves. And like a lot of religious people don't have that. They'll not question things and accept your place in the universe and accept the fact that you have meaning and you matter and live forever. Yeah, it's easy to see how that can be adaptive at an individual level.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Yeah, I never thought of it that way. I just find it so hard to relate to neurotic people.
You're not neurotic at all. You've never been neurotic.
I literally just don't feel it at all. There
You
there
never
was like this
feel.
one time where so this is a deep cut. There's a fellow
What does deep
Substacker
cut mean? Does that mean you're
who
gonna? What does that mean? You keep
it
saying
just
that.
means it's like a long and unrelated tangent.
Oh, you know what I thought? I thought deep cut meant you're gonna cut this out. I thought that's. I'd never heard the phrase before, but okay, go ahead.
Oh, no. This is staying in, probably. There's a fellow Substacker. I'm not sure if he wants to be named about this because this was a private conversation, but I'll credit him if he wants it. Where he was pitching me meditation. And he was like, meditation has been so great for me. I'm like, really? What do you get out of meditation? I've never felt it really benefiting. It really clears my thoughts. There are things that I want to get out of my head and I meditate and it goes away. I'm like, this is can't you just do that? Just stop thinking about a thing? And apparently the answer is no. Apparently a lot of people can't do that.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. I think I was very neurotic when I was growing up. I have obsessions that I keep thinking about, but it's usually adaptive. I have to do this one thing, and I usually relate it to my work or something like that. Like maybe I should be like thinking at a higher level of what my goals are. Maybe I should not be like on social media so much to take an obvious example. But yeah, the idea that like I have these thoughts and they can't go away and I want them. Oh, what does that mean though? You're trying to live in denial or you're trying to try to
No, like
be
just
more
in the moment, you want to sit down, you want to get something done and you like don't want to have intrusive thoughts.
is
You
it
know
big
that
oh is it to like a productivity hack or is it like you want to enjoy there's also like a thing you could just want to enjoy the moment because you want to enjoy the moment.
I
um
think it's both. It's like a self-control thing, right?
Yeah.
Except I was just really surprised that like people don't have this naturally of yeah, I'm just going to stop thinking about this for now and I'm going to do something else and then maybe I think about it later, but
Yeah, I mean,
for
I'm
now I'm going to
lucky
stop
because the
thinking
things
about
I'm
it.
obsessed with, I just write about. If I'm obsessed with something, I'll just write about it or I'll tweet about it at least. So it's like very nice that I've been able to make my job my obsession, so I don't have to stop thinking about my obsessions. But then, like, I do relate to wanting to clear your mind, just be able to like take a walk or something. That I could do it. I can really force myself, but I'd like to be able to do it more. It's not a big enough. It's not like a big enough thing where because I enjoy myself anyways. Like my head is in the clouds, but it's not a big enough thing where like I would invest tons of time into like being better. Yeah, if I could turn a
Yeah, and many
switch.
people would.
Yeah, I know. I get it. Yeah, I get it.
Let's go back to Ayn Rand.
Okay, we've never been on Ayn Rand, but yeah, let's go to Ayn Rand.
Yeah, we talked about her with the libertarians a little bit,
No,
but
that's
yeah. So Ayn Rand, kind of moral defense, moral and intellectual defense of libertarianism or objectivism. She's never called herself a libertarian. Values that many libertarians would be friendly towards. Um, why is it so rare to get a moral defense of libertarianism or free markets?
yeah. I don't know Ayn Rand herself. So I have two articles, two very long articles on Ayn Rand, and look into every part of her psychology and philosophy. Um, I don't know. It is historically, it hasn't always been that case. Again, like there's a lot of elite human capital libertarian or pro-market movements, and I think in like the ex-Soviet Union, like I think that's a place where the people there are like I think elites are more pro-market. They came out of communism like that. I I think there's probably like a lot of randomness and like how people think about economics. We weren't like evolved to have I don't think we even have strong intuitions about economics because populism will elevate like socialists and populism will also elevate like Javier Milei, right? Because people will just it's like populism is just like an attitude and it can have wildly different policy orientations, right? And Ayn Rand would say conservatives have not made the or libertarians or pro-market people or whoever have not made the case. They've always argued on pragmatic grounds, while liberals have appealed to, she'd say appeal to morality, but we could say appeal to emotions. But yeah, I think it's my like model is like society can go either direction, and like the correlation between, and I mentioned this in my book, forthcoming book, like the correlation between social views and intelligence and forms of elite human capital is like pretty much perfect. Like everywhere or practically everywhere, more intelligent, more idealistic people are more socially liberal, but it's like almost 50-50 as far as whether they tend towards markets or not relative to the population they come out of. And I think it's just like we don't have strong intuitions about these things, and so it depends on like history and like interest groups and the cultural milieu, which is it's like a kind of a it's like a non-answer, but that's my answer. It's just like we're in a particular period where our elites are. There is, I don't know. Do we
Even
have
the
moral?
earliest defense of markets, though, or at least one of the earliest, Adam Smith, he talks about it from a pragmatic angle of
Yeah,
it's not that the butcher really cares about you, but he
yeah.
cares about himself, and that's why he
Yeah,
gives
although
you
someone told me I should read Adam Smith's book on sentiments. It's
yeah
just
theory of
they,
moral sentiments. He
yeah,
does, but I'm not sure he's explaining it in a kind of libertarian or proto rationalist way. But I don't think it's particularly a. I haven't read it in some time, but at least
yeah.
by my
It's not
memory,
a
it's
moral.
not
It's
a
not a moral defense.
particularly moral defense.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I feel like I haven't. Yeah, I gave my answer, but it's not very satisfying.
Yeah, I do just think there's just a sense of envy. There's just a sense that people want to see successful people, especially economically successful people, fail. Yeah, I think that's just like part of human nature.
Part of human nature is envy. So do people like sit around like wanting celebrities to fail? It's maybe in some ways.
Yeah, look at how far people are, how much people are drawn to like celebrity drama and them ruining their lives. They love it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. It's yeah, but there is a kind of it depends on the celebrity. I
They
mean, it can be
want them
very.
to ruin their lives.
It depends on yeah, I mean, but it does feel very contingent. Yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, and
Like,
there's love. There's both, right? There's
yeah,
both.
and just to be, like, focused on money, like, the people who are best at capitalism, I think, are not necessarily the most charismatic individuals, like that guy who got shot. Who was the
The
United?
UHC healthcare CEO.
Yeah, we don't even remember his
Um,
name. We remember Luigi Mangione though. Is it Brian Thompson? Is that it?
yeah, I think it was Brian something.
I
United
think it's Brian Thompson. I'd be
Healthcare
surprised if it's not Brian Thompson. Yeah, it is Brian
CEO.
Thompson. I'm right. Yeah. So
Um,
we have a hard time remembering Brian Thompson, who's just good at you know making money and becoming a corporate CEO. But we all remember Luigi, who did something
yeah, fact
idealistic,
check true. It is Brian
even though
Thompson.
even though his brain was completely scrambled and desperate. People are desperate to find that he's some kind of romantic hero. Um,
Yeah, Luigi
yeah,
is a funny name though. It is.
Luigi Mangione. Yeah, it is funny. That is true.
The people were making memes of Luigi from Mario, right? I think it was a more memorable name. But I think the underlying point, you're right. It's fair enough. That like also that like violence is quite charismatic, right? This is something that's
Yeah.
just the truth of the world. You might not like
Yeah.
it, but it is just true.
I don't know. You ever meet someone who's like just into money? It's not you don't want to talk to them. It's not very interesting. Like a person who's just just looks like the homo economicus is like a kind of person who's like socially, I think socially useful in many cases, in most cases, especially when you have the capitalist system is functioning well, but just not romantic. People want sort of danger, they want idealism, they want just not someone who's just counting his dollars and benefiting from compound interest and looking for market opportunities and so forth. There's just nothing romantic about it. Why would it be? Why would the socially the pro-social thing necessarily be the most romantic or inspiring? We have no reason to think that would be the case.
Yeah, and all another thing that's really interesting is that a lot of actually quite high-paying work might not be intellectually stimulating.
Yeah,
Right. Like running a car dealership, you're probably just selling things or placing orders. You're not learning that many new things about the world. You might learn like a few new things about like the car industry, but you're not an intellectual. It's not intellectually stimulating.
yeah. You think of a lot of lawyer work. Some of it is intellectually stimulating. Most of it's not. It's just like learning the law, the specific area that is a world you get into and pays money. Think about accountants, just people with numbers and figuring out who has to pay this amount of taxes and so forth. Yeah, nothing romantic, nothing idealistic. This is why some boring that's why boring things pay well, and then like idealistic things like being an anthropology PhD doesn't pay well because a lot of people want to do that, right?
Yeah, there's the demand. Do you consider like a software engineer or even just like any kind of high-paying technical person? Do you consider them elite human capital?
It's kind of a spectrum. It really does depend on the individual. Some people in tech are very idealistic. They maybe spectrum is not. I don't know if that's the best way to think about it, but yeah, I think
Like
it
a
really
guy who is just really into optimizing matrix multiplications, right? Is that guy elite human capital?
probably more than the guy who is just into being the best car salesman in a village or something. But yeah, probably not as much as academia or journalist. That person's not going to fundamentally shift the culture.
Yeah, fair enough. I know several such people. I love you guys, but
Yeah,
sorry, the ruling is in.
sorry.
You're not elite human
It's true.
capital.
It's a kind of fun thing. It's this thing is it's hard to it's like an idea that I'm capturing it in like different ways. It's like the reading, watching TV. It's elite human capital, low human capital. It's try to understand there's something real here. There's something unique about these kind of status maximizers that make them the EHC or liberals or same thing aside, they make them different from other humans. I think they don't think about that enough. I don't think they think about like how weird they are because they're surrounded with other EHC.
Yeah, it becomes much of an echo chamber, maybe
Yeah,
even more of an echo chamber than than the matrix multiplying guy.
yeah,
Although that guy might be in an echo chamber too. Who knows?
yeah. It's like water. I mean, it's like fish in the water, right? It's like they just don't know what's out there.
I just have written here Tucker Carlson. I don't really know how to go into this, but Tucker is a fascinating figure because he's obviously a very skilled person. Tucker is a high skilled person, maybe the most skilled person is in his job. You look at especially the older the Fox News monologues, right? These were like handcrafted. They are like works of art. They are like perfectly. They're both works of art and works of science, and like how optimized they are. but he's someone who you single out as appealing or agreeing with these low human capital
Yeah.
ideologies or beliefs. How does that happen?
How does Tucker Carlson become like crazy? So the EHC is like individuals, like you could have an EHC individual in the low human capital culture, and that person's going to start to exhibit many of the traits of low human capital, because what makes elite human capital smart is it's the social networks and the culture that it's embedded in. Once a lot of
Okay, this is
once
a really interesting aspect. We should put a pin in that, but continue.
Yeah. So once in a while, and then, but like when a person finds himself like outside of that circle for whatever, for reasons of psychology or personal resentment or whatever, they can start to take on the characteristics of low human capital. I think that happened to Tucker to a certain extent. I think he's like angry. He's like not well. I think that sort of wokeness just broke his brain. And yeah, that's how we ended up. It is just it got weirder and weirder until Stranger and Stranger Things became more epistemologically closed, right? Open mind, but oh, here's a UFO guy. Here's a guy who sees demons. Here's a guy who thinks he had sex with Obama, right? But it was just like completely closed to any like reasonable sources of information or smart people who know what they're talking about. And yeah, it's what happens. I think he's just an extreme case of what's happened to a lot of people who are smart and right leaning. I think a lot of the Silicon Valley people are like this, are just like they become too distrustful of EHC, and so like internet anonymous accounts like start to shape their worldview, not consciously, but just like that's all they pay attention to, and that shapes them in a certain direction.
Yeah, this is a really interesting aspect that we haven't talked about enough. Maybe I don't understand well enough of like how I was thinking about it before is EHC is a set of psychological traits, right? Maybe it's not just IQ, but it's like some combination of IQ and conscientiousness and agreeableness. But yeah, this point of like, it's not just that; it's the social circle, it's the community, it's the reality based
Yeah.
community.
But that's more interesting than the individual psychological traits, because when you have groups get together with
Okay.
certain psychological traits, they become it's more than just the sum of their parts. They start to take on certain characteristics, right? Is the average how different is the average conservative versus liberal? Psychologically different. But what about their way of receiving information and interacting with the world? That's way, way different because they're part of different cultural environments.
Yeah, and yeah, you talk about this in terms of reading, in terms of watching TV. I'm just trying to do this reevaluation.
Yeah. Yeah. The
So
reading,
so
watching
how
TV
so
references
so
kind of,
is
yeah, go ahead.
so is elite human capital like if you were to break it down into a percentage, and maybe this is not necessarily fair, but if you were to estimate how much of it is based on thinking internal things and how much of it is based on external, how much of it is psychology versus sociology, right?
How much of, yeah, how much, I guess you could, you're asking the emphasis of the theory of what am I trying to explain? And I think probably 80 the cultural aspect and maybe 20% the individual differences. The individual differences are important,
Wow.
and cultures are fundamentally based on the people who make them up. But yeah, it's much more interesting to think about these cultural differences. There's all kinds of studies and thought on individual differences. And you could just look at any chart and say, oh, here's neuroticism, here's IQ, whatever. That's done. You can do that simply, and people do that all the time. But this is something new. This is really thinking about the sociological aspects here.
Yeah. So how should these institutions change? Both the institutions. Let's start with the elite human capital themselves. How should they better themselves?
Yeah. So yeah, this is previewing some of the articles that or some of the chapters that are going to be in the book that haven't been written about anywhere else yet. I do think there is a kind of masculine feminine angle to this, and I think that I think the feminization is a kind of powerful angle with which to understand what has happened. And I think the way I put it, through most of human history until very recently, like toxic masculinity was like the curse of humanity. There was people like kings trying to take over the world, and people fighting wars and all this kind of the oppression. These are male coded kind of behavior. And then we developed like the entire enlightenment as a way to the entire sort of the system of progress, of like moral progress, has been like trying to find ways to like box that in or check it, right? Constitutional government, democracy, markets, human rights, all that good stuff. And but we haven't even begun to think about like toxic femininity. And I think that we've gone too far, like elite human capital has gone too far in that direction. I think that there is like one thing I noticed about people in academia, men, is that they don't have courage as like an ideal, right? If they're scared to speak up about an issue, they'll just tell me like without shame, "Oh, I'd like to say that, but I'm afraid." And just the fact that not that you're afraid, but like you talk about it in that way and not that you're not ashamed of it, I think is very interesting. It indicates like something about your value system. And think about how like horrified they are if like a suggestion, like they have a an inclination that they might be racist. It's, oh my God, I'm racist. I better work to change, introspect, try to be something better. I feel that way about cowardice if I feel like I'm being cowardly in some way. And I notice that academics don't have that. So a part of it, I think, is just these cultural norms are just feminine in the extreme, like being masculine, virtuous, like standing up for yourself, standing up for what you think is right, being cold-hearted and shut off to certain appeals when the time calls for it. I think that's like completely missing. So it's partly that, partly like elite human capital just needs to be ideologically turned in a better direction. Like I think that they have to understand that like markets are actually good. I think there's like there's specific kinds of there's
They should
ideological
embrace
currents.
abundance liberalism as
Yeah,
reclaimed liberalism.
exactly. I actually, yeah, that's exactly. I say exactly that. I say abundance liberalism is like elite human capital working itself out. It's moving in the right direction. It's like it's seeing where they went wrong, where their policies haven't worked. And this is I'm going to be writing more about this about the abundance agenda, and I've been talking to Thompson and Klein about this. It's going to be they don't go far enough because it's like this didn't happen by accident, liberalism. It had a bunch of assumptions that sort of led to that. I hate those arguments. I hate this argument like, oh, wokeness because you had the Enlightenment. I hate those arguments, those right-coined arguments that sort of drive me insane. But this case, I think it's true because you could just look at the policies that the abundance agenda people complain about, and you could look at red and blue states. And why did the blue states end up like this? And why does Europe have some bad growth? I think that once you are not as steadfast in the defense of the markets, if you just see if your prior is that like free markets and regulations are equally likely to be good, you're going to end up regulations will win every time because that's where public opinion is. That's where most people's intuitions is. You need the framework of like you need to start out with a framework of a prior of freedom comes first, and not just like freedom after like housing has failed for an infrastructure has failed for 40 years, then come back and say, oh, we need to introduce some market forces. Like, fine, you might do good things, but you need to rethink like how you got here. And so, yeah, there's this
Oh,
ideological component. There's like this masculinization moment, this exact masculinization aspect of it. And I think that so that's elite human. That's I think the elite human capital. I also think there's elite human capital has gone wrong in the West, but I don't think elite human capital has gone wrong in like the developed world. I think there they could just use more elite human capital in a lot of cases, and just like we should just support EHC movements and factions.
yeah, amazing things are happening in India. Amazing things are happening in Indonesia.
But
Maybe
what do
not
you say? What do you
recently.
say India? Explain India a bit.
They're just developing. They're just modernizing.
They are modernizing, yeah. Like, I wonder is Modi like an
I
elite
guess
human?
Modi, yeah, Modi's kind of a nationalist.
Yeah, but even but you know what? Now that I think about it, the elite human capital in India were like the people who sterilized like the entire country and set up socialism and set up the caste system. Maybe even in the third world, maybe the elite human capital is more dangerous. I don't know. I have to think about it. But maybe
Yeah,
it's probably Latin America. I think has too much ideology, leftist ideology, without the American antibodies leads to disastrous results. I'm
yeah.
thinking Eastern Europe probably.
India as well, right? They were under the direct influence of the Soviet Union, and that's gone now.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. I think that elite human capital, probably not a third world, clean third world, first world division, but there are some places where elite human capital is unambiguous good and some places where it's not, and some places where it just needs to be fought.
Yeah,
But I think
I'm,
what's
I'm
important thing is, I think elite human capital like need understandings of like their own weaknesses and own weaknesses and how, and we should think about ways that they can check each other's worst impulses because that's always going to be there.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So I am just fascinated by this discussion of abundance liberalism. I think the most important idea in abundance liberalism is the idea that the groups are evil and you need to get them out of the room. like that the Sunrise Movement just needs to be like destroyed and torn apart and blacklisted. I think this is the most important idea in elite human capital. Now, the most important idea in abundance liberalism, because it, like you said, it gets to the reason why all of this happened. Why are there NIMBYs? Why are there unions? Why are there regulators? They have a constituency, and they have people who are paid full time to advocate against abundance liberal policies and advocate for the things that make things worse. And you need to just get them out of there. That's the real political action
Yeah, you
that
need
that
Donald. You
matters,
need
not writing the policy papers and so on. Although I think
Yeah,
that matters a little
you need
bit.
Donald Trump. That's the thing. That's you can tell them because the NEPA. I was surprised at how far he went with the NEPA stuff. This is the stuff that they've always hated, and the executive orders were pretty amazing on that. Although he did do some things that are anti-independence agenda, namely solar and wind. We'll see if that becomes permanent. But on NEPA, that could be much more far-reaching, and there should be more. I don't think the progress people were like as excited about that as they should be, or the abundance crowd.
Yeah, I still think they dislike Donald Trump as a person and because of Jan 6 and for various reasons. That might make sense in their worldview. Um, I was less surprised by the NEPA stuff. There have been a lot of like right wing anti NEPA people in DC.
And on the left too, but it took the right to do it. That's like a lesson there. One thing I was reading about was yeah,
I think the
self-driving
left wing
cars.
ones are more online, but there are just like a lot of people that like the Koch
Yeah,
Foundation pays to oppose NEPA.
it's funny. Yeah, the right wing policy people are like smart, and then like if you just look at right wing from what's going on, the discourse from the Trump campaign, or like the online discourse, right? It just seems so stupid. But then you have people with smart ideas behind that who just don't have followings because rightoidism is just marching morons, and it's amazing. Like they sometimes enact good policies, the ones that the smartest people on the left um, say we need. So yeah, it's a kind of fascinating thing. I think it's. Oh, I was gonna say I was reading this story while she posted about self driving cars. And so the regulatory environment around self driving cars, it's basically here's something that's not ideologically coded, and you hear Tucker Carlson, our friend, saying I would ban self driving cars, and so you
Is he
think, oh, maybe
still
well,
anti self driving car?
well, I
I
don't know.
thought
No,
Elon
I've
convinced
just heard
him
him. I've
self
heard him say
driving
that
cars are
once. I'm
good.
sure he is because he's anti all technology. But anyway, he was against. He's been against self driving cars, and but then you look at which states are like making it easier or harder to employ self driving cars. It's labor unions that are the problem. It's leftist regulators, and basically the red states are freer on self driving cars. So here's something. Here's like a perfect experiment because it's something that doesn't have ideological valence, and you could see where Republicans are in power, they're handling it better than Democrats. And so this is like a powerful argument you could take that I'll soon take to the abundance agenda people and say, look at this. What do you make of this?
You should just be like the new neocons. You should just become
You should be the
Republicans.
new yeah, you should be the new neocons. Yeah. It's the right wing has to be like hijacked because it's so stupid. Someone has to come in and hijack it, right? So it's the neocons, and then it's like
Yeah,
it's kind of a
Ezra
white hat.
Klein is the new
Yeah, the new Irving
the
Crystal.
new Irving Crystal.
Ooh. No, it's there is a kind of aesthetic thing with Ezra Klein, it just doesn't work. It does. I don't know. Maybe those Jews. Maybe
He
those
has
New
the
York
tattoos
Jews.
now. He's lifting.
He's lifting. He's tattooed. Maybe that's it.
It's
Maybe
gonna
he's
happen. It's
transforming.
gonna
Maybe
happen.
he's transforming into Neocon. He's becoming masculine like Crystal and Podhoretz. I think for New York City Jews, like it's more natural than I don't know Ezra Klein, West Coast Jew. Maybe that's the difference. Iglesias.
Is
He
he
could go back.
not in New York now?
I think
I think
Klein.
he's there. He's
Ezra Klein.
working for the New York
Yeah, but
Times.
I think he grew up in California, so I'm thinking of sort of cultural background.
Okay. People can change, especially elite human
Yeah,
capital.
he could change. He could. Yeah, well, he's not. He's all serious. He's not going anywhere. Yeah, the neocon example is interesting. He's there. There is a kind of yeah. There's a way where it doesn't. The abundance agenda is like oriented differently. The people like who find the right appealing are just like very kind of zero sum in their thinking and simplistic, right? It just is almost like nuance doesn't work, right? Like you can't have that. You can't be that kind of guy and like have a big following on the right, but you can be behind the scenes and like influence policy or like even get an important job, right? That happens all the time.
Yeah, a lot of, and the NEPA people have been doing good work, and they won, as we said. They absolutely won. Yeah, you can do good work. You can get things done. Yeah, it's the exception, to me at least, the exception is really Alex Stopp is really the exception of being able to make the NEPA charts or the permitting charts or the housing charts go viral on Twitter. That's the weird thing. That's surprising to me. That most people can't do that. That's just you post a chart and it doesn't go viral. That's just like a day. That's just like a Tuesday.
Yeah, it's levels of virality. It's so funny. I post like girls dancing, like that could get 20 million. Like even my top political tweets will never get, well, they'll top out at 1 or 2 million views. So yeah, charts could go viral for charts. Like charts could get hundreds of thousands on Twitter, and one tweet is not a big deal anymore. But yeah, they go a little bit viral by the standards of like political discourse.
Yeah, that and Ezra as well. Like this is the thing that has just really impressed me about all these people is just that their ability to like meme substantive material, right? This is something that I've tried to draw inspiration from in terms of meming substantive material. And yeah, it's hard. It's not easy.
You're saying Ezra Klein does this?
Yeah, Ezra Klein can have.
But he's unique because there used to be like Andrew Sullivan. You think about Andrew Sullivan's influence on gay marriage, basically single handedly like started talking about this and making this a thing. You could do that. Like you could. There used to be more like these intellectual entrepreneurs who could
But that's
just.
harder. I think making gay marriage go viral is a lot easier than making like NEPA reform go viral.
I don't think it's got viral as much as gay marriage has got viral. It's just like to the extent that like anyone thinks about housing policy or infrastructure or whatever. Yeah, but what I'm saying is it's all because he's at the New York Times. There's only the New York Times. Maybe Iglesias can do this. He's on his own. That's basically it. No Atlantic writers are not making things go viral. Like Vox writers, a little bit. Washington Post writer. It's just like the New York Times it used to be more a distributed culture. I think was it the New Republic where Andrew Sullivan wrote was his gay marriage article? Might have been New
I believe
Republic. It might have
so.
been something. It was where?
I believe it was the New Republic.
Okay, he was the editor at New Republic, so I don't know if we're confusing them together. But anyways, like there was like this network of like important magazines, like New Republic on the right, National Review, Commentary was a much bigger deal. Is Commentary even still around? It is still around.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But they were all much bigger deals, and there was like the public intellectuals, Christopher Hitchens. He'd go talk to like his friends, and they'd have debates and stuff. There's just less of that. There's like right wing influencers, there's left wing influencers, but there's just like one thing, the New York Times, and I think just Ross Douthat because he's like the conservative writer at the New York Times. And then like Ezra Klein because he's the most prominent liberal writer at the New York Times. Just a few people at the New York Times can have these outsized influence.
Is that true? Is Ezra like the top New York Times person now?
I would say he's the most popular, the most well-known writer. Maybe Maureen Dowd. Maybe like boomers remember Maureen Dowd, and maybe
Yeah.
Krugman. I guess he was also like this. He just
Krugman's out, but yeah.
yeah. So you have like think about the other writers. Yeah, you have Bret Stephens. I don't think anyone considers him an intellectual force. David French, like hated by leftists and hated by rightists, and not really a voice of anyone. Doesn't make things go viral. Just he's just a symbol for people. Yeah, I think Klein made Biden drop out. That was his work. He was the one who made this thinkable, and like the environment was ready for when Biden had that disastrous debate.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah. Yeah, I was just wondering because in terms of pure numbers wise, I think he might we just know him because he's more well read in the kind of in the kind of abundance liberal
Yeah.
world.
Like David Brooks, I don't know, like fame, like pure fame. Maybe because they've been around longer. Like maybe David Brooks and Maureen Dowd,
Yeah,
and
David
for all
Brooks,
I know,
Maureen
their
Dowd,
articles
good
might get more
candidates.
page views. I don't know. They might get more page views, and maybe not than Ezra Klein. But yeah, they're not like influencing policy really.
Probably less than Ezra.
Yeah, he's easily the
Um,
most influential policy person at the New York Times, easily.
wow, that's where elite human capital can take you.
Yeah, yeah, it's quite the accomplishment. Yeah, he's a pretty singular figure. Yeah.
You want to end it there with praise for Ezra?
If you want, I can go a little longer, but it's up to you.
Yeah, I know. I feel like I understand this a lot better. I understand the concept of elite human capital. Of yeah, maybe I feel like the questions aren't coming to me right now, but I'm reevaluating real time how I think about the theory because, like I said earlier, I thought of it much more as a psychological theory than a sociological theory.
Yeah. Yeah, and to be fair, I'm also always reevaluating it. It's not like my other books where I knew what I wanted to say before I wrote them. It's like I'm just like, there's a constellation of ideas here, and I'm thinking about like how it all fits together. And I'm still thinking, I've thought about like American context, but I haven't thought about India that strongly. Like, I want a theory that can tell us something about most of the world. And so, yeah, that's where I'm at with it.
So I just clicked back on the Ayn Rand article that I had open in the background, your Ayn Rand article, and I was like, how do we get elite human capital to be more pro-natalist? We'll end on
Um,
that.
this is like the toughest nut to this is maybe the toughest nut to crack, because we've seen elite human capital be capitalist. We have, it's hard to, I guess we've, to see elite human capital as pro-natalist, maybe the early 20th century, when sort of eugenics was a thing and like upper class people thought it was good to have kids. I think you have to kill environmentalism first. I'm reading my friend Alex Epstein's book Fossil Future right now. A lot of the stuff I knew already, but this is really a poisonous ideology, and it fits into just like hating life and hating humanity. And they've been anti-natalists, explicitly before. Now it's more implicit, if at all, but like still, it's just like it's focus on its story of humanity. It's understanding at the highest level of who we are and like what's important and what determines human flourishing is just so wrong and so backwards. And I think that's probably the first step. I think you really need to destroy this ideology, and then maybe the pronatalist thing will it's maybe the pronatalist thing will piggyback on that. It's interesting. Vance and Musk, people are starting to talk about it. 5-10 years ago, nobody talked about natalism. What good it'll do, I don't know. We'll still see.
Yeah. So Ezra, join us in our crusade to destroy the Sunrise Movement and have abundance, liberalism, pronatalism become the law of the land.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should take something from rightoids too. There is a kind of, yeah, I don't think, does it happen with Ezra Klein's, like he has the ideas. Like you need the attitude maybe of rightists, like directionally, and maybe like the ideas and the reflective quality of the best of liberalism. So that's the synthesis. Last chapter of the Huey Capital book is just called Synthesis. I'm going to try to put it all together.
Yeah. Is there something about the current Democratic Party that's made it so uncharismatic? Or is it just chance, right? Because we had Obama. That wasn't that long ago, and he was very charismatic.
Yeah, I think
Who do
it's
we have
important to.
now? Like Mayor Pete?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize, yeah, that individuals do matter. Like we see that with Trump, obviously. One individual who's like a very charismatic leader can set the tone. Yeah, it was depressing because they did end up with, for the last 4 years, they ended up with Biden, who was always slow. He appointed a black woman as his vice president because just for identity politics reasons. She turned out to be like, she makes people laugh and she has joy, but not competent. And everyone can see that, and not quick on her feet, not good with words. And then, so yeah, they've been stuck with Biden and then Kamala as the leaders of their party. Now, they don't have a backup like it's Sanders and Warren. They're both geriatric socialists. So that's going to inspire some people, but not like Obama. Not broad or inclusive enough. I was like, and you look at the next generation, like Whitmer and Shapiro. Yeah, they're better. I like them better than Warren and Sanders. We'll see. I'm still wondering if anyone can be like a 60% approval rating. I wonder if any president can have a 60% approval rating anymore, given how polarized things are. We haven't seen it in a while. We haven't seen it since Obama. And so that's what 8 years, 9 years now.
Yeah, Obama was the last president that wasn't for Red America, wasn't for Blue America,
Yeah, he
was
was
for
for
all
the
of
United States
America.
of America, right? So I wonder, is it possible? Like, it's possible, maybe, because all we've had last few years is Trump. Okay, he's going to be polarizing. Senile Biden. Okay, him being senile is going to be like a problem.
I think
Incompetent
JD could
Kamala.
actually do it.
Maybe. Maybe Gavin Newsom, maybe get Gretchen Whitmer. Like, Gretchen Whitmer is popular at her state level in a state that's purple. I think she's always had good approval ratings. Maybe you just need someone who's not Trump and who's not senile. We haven't had that. We've had a decade of everyone being Trump or senile, or one affirmative action lady who slipped through the cracks. That's it. That's been the entire every presidential ticket of the last 8 years. So it's a decade. It's a long time, and that influences the vibe. I don't know. Now it could be that, like, we had Hillary, but Hillary. Okay, so Hillary is interesting
Hillary
because
was not charismatic at all.
she started out with an approval rate. She started out with an approval rating when she was Secretary of State, very high, and as she ran, it plummeted. Now, did she change as a person or what? Or was it just the environment is super negative, and that's going to happen to anyone? Anyone is going to have a sub 50% approval rating. That's what we see. Politicians who are
Yeah,
not
it might have been
charismatic, like
also just Obama's influence, right?
Obama's
Oh,
influence.
he's Obama's or she's Obama's Secretary of State.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see. It'll be interesting to see if anyone can be popular. That's something to look forward to. And then, but the Democrats, I think, like why the vibes are so bad. I think it's been this kind of neurotic polarization, right? I think that they are like a demonstration of like a cautionary tale of elite human capital gone wild, right? Because Trump drew all the elite human capital to their side. They became like super pathological altruism went off the charts. They became very woke. They became fearful of everything, and like everyone who like wanted to smile or laugh or be entertained became a Trump fan. And so it's like they're left with just like these gloomy kind of people. They're more depressed on average, and it's remember like during the 2024 race, it's like the polls would be tied and Republicans are like, oh, it's going to be a blowout. We're going to win. And Democrats are like, oh man, we got to change Biden. We got to come on the ticket. They just thought they were like finished. They were just so black pilled. Like the polls would be tied and the Republicans would be like so happy. And and Democrats lost by 1.5 percentage points. And then now they are very self-reflective. And imagine if Trump lost by 1.5 percentage points, they would have said it was rigged, and really he had support of 90% of the country, and Musk would be amplifying this, and everyone on conservatism would agree that Republicans were like the more popular party, and they actually won the election. And so this is just like differences in human capital, but it's like neuroticism and like positive thinking. So yeah, they're in this funk. If Obama could run again, and he probably could help get them out of it, whether like this can self-correct or whether it correct through new leadership. But yeah, that's remains to be seen.
Yeah, that's a great place to end it.
Okay,
Thanks so much
thanks,
for
Paul.
doing the podcast, Richard.
Yeah, enjoyed it.